panel. The last audio clips go, dear participants. Welcome to the 10th Belgrade Security Forum. The next panel will start soon. When that clip plays, moderator can wait a second or two, and then he can start a panel. Thank you, and I wish you all the best. Thank you once again for joining us.
Welcome to the 10th iteration of the Belgrade Security Forum. Dear participants, you can use the chat option to take an active part in the Belgrade Security Forum panels and sessions. Dear participants, you can use the Ask a Question option to pose a question to our speakers. This session is organized in partnership with the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to Serbia, part of the MATRA Program of the Dutch Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Dear participants, welcome to the 10th Belgrade Security Forum. Our next panel will start soon.
Good online panels started with a technical glitch, so if we are judging by that, I guess this one is going to be a good panel as well. I would like to welcome you to the last panel of a very long day of the 10th iteration of Belgrade Security Forum. My name is Bojan Elek, and I'm a senior researcher at Belgrade Center for Security Policy. And I'm also a coordinator of the Western Balkans Organized Crime Radar, a network of 6 think tanks currently trying to establish ourselves as the researchers of organized crime in the Western Balkans. This is why I'm extremely pleased to have this opportunity to moderate the panel on the impact of COVID-19 on organized crime, which is organized with the support of the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Needless to say, the global pandemic had a profound impact on every aspect of our life. And I think it is only a poetic justice that I'm forced to moderate this panel from a COVID-19-induced self-isolation instead of being in the state-of-the-art studio across town with the rest of Belgrade Security Forum team. This and similar online, offline experiences are very tangible impacts of COVID-19 that are easy to understand. But the pandemic has also affected our lives and our societies in less visible ways. And organized crime is one of these areas, which is by definition clandestine in its nature. And these changes are hidden from our eyes. Just think for a second. People not leaving homes and moving their activities online have gave rise to cybercrime, tightly controlled borders, disrupted drug supply chains and human trafficking routes. Think of drug users who are actually very rarely thought of, who might have lost jobs due to economic downturn and now have lost also access to drugs due to disruption of markets. Has the global pandemic, coupled with the fragility of states and their inability to promptly respond to the changing nature of illicit markets, created a perfect storm for organized crime to flourish? This is the question that I don't have the answers to, but I am pleased to have great panelists who I hope do. And without further ado, I would like to start presenting the experts that we've gathered tonight here to discuss these issues. I will start with Ms. Angela May. She is the chief of the Research and Threat Analysis Branch at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC. And she's overseeing global, regional, and national research in the areas of drugs and crime. She holds a PhD in statistics from the University of Padua, and she is the name behind some important publications such as the World Drug Report or Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, among others. Second, we have Mr. Mark Shaw, who is the director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, an international NGO. He holds a PhD from the University of, bear with me, Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, and he has published widely on organized crime, security, and justice reform issues. He has previously worked for UNODC, University of Cape Town, and the South African government. Next, we have Mr. Keith Ditchem, who is a senior research fellow and acting director of the Organized Crime and Policing Research Group at Royal United Services Institute, the famous RUSI. He has 2 decades of expertise dealing with working on serious and organized crime in North, South, Central Americas and Europe. and he has experience working both as a practitioner and at a strategic level working with the UK government. And he is currently obtaining a doctorate in security risk management. Next, we have Mr. Sasha Stroup, who works for Europol, the EU's Agency for Law Enforcement Cooperation, as a strategic analyst. He holds several degrees in politics, international law, criminal justice, and he has been a key contributor to some of Europol's flagship products, such as the Serious and Organized Crime Threat Assessment, the so-called SOCTA, EU drugs market report, and similar. And as of recently, he has reported on the impact of COVID-19 on the security landscape in the European Union. And last but not least, we have Mr. Giuseppe Sorrenti, who is an assistant professor of economics at the Amsterdam School of Economics, University of Amsterdam. He holds PhD in economics, a lot of economics, from the University of Turin and Collegio Carlo Alberto. He did his postdoc at the University of Zurich, and his main research areas are labor economics, but he has also published work regarding the infiltration of organized crime in the Italian legal economy, which is something that we will discuss at length tonight. Before we move on, it is late, it has been a very long day, and we have agreed to have a debate with several rounds of questions to keep things interesting and provide, so I would ask you to provide concrete, concise answers around 1 minute each. I encourage you to engage with each other, and later we will have additional time to provide remarks and answer questions from the audience. This being said, let's move on. The first round of questions is just to introduce our viewers regarding the impact of COVID-19 on organized crime trends. And I would like to start off with Ms. Angela May, who works for UNODC, as I mentioned. And UNODC has produced several reports since the offset of the pandemics. Can you tell us briefly what are some main trends when it comes to the changes that it brought regarding organized crime?
Well, organized crime reacted to the COVID pandemic as always organized crime does, taking opportunities. And I just want to mention a couple of opportunities. One is on the strengthening their territorial control. We have examples throughout the world, from Italy to Mexico to Brazil to Afghanistan, where organized crime groups have substituted themselves with the government, so providing reliefs to the communities, and so strengthening their ties with the communities. The other opportunity that they have, that organized crime has taken, has been the gap in the supply and demand of COVID-related medical products. We all experience in our life that all of a sudden we need things that we didn't need before, like masks, protective equipment. And that is an area where organized crime very quickly took an opportunity and responded to the supply gap with falsified product or with scams. And we have seen emerging very organized crimes with transnational organized crime groups threatening the health of the population with offering either falsified or non-existent medical products. Over to you.
It's a very broad strokes. Now let's go to Mr. Shaw from Global Initiative. Your organization has published COVID Crime Watch, a series of reports, podcast stories from around the world. Could you tell us what are the key takeaways to add more details to this picture? Mr. Shaw.
Thanks, Bojan. A couple of points. Firstly, to say that I think the impact of COVID-19 on organized crime is not uniform. So there has been, I think, different impacts on different markets and different impacts in different time periods. And I think that's an important point to make. In the initial period of the lockdown, I think you can isolate a series of disruptions to particular markets. And in the phase that we're in now, which is more, of course, the pandemic continues, but the sense of economic crisis emerging brings new impacts in relation to organized crime. I just want to highlight 3 markets as examples, at least from our experience and from global reporting. The first is perhaps surprisingly that, at least in terms of drug trafficking, potentially less in terms of drug distribution in particular areas, there has been surprisingly little impact, or less impact than I think we had anticipated at the beginning during the period of lockdown. The second market where I think the long-term impacts of COVID-19 will be felt is really in the cyber sphere. And the numbers are truly astonishing if you look across the reporting from around the world, both in the initial lockdown with websites and IP holders reporting some 30,000% increase in COVID-19 related fraud, and the targeting of people spending more and more time on computers. Now, that's a trend that was already occurring, and in a sense, COVID-19 accelerated that trend. In terms of migrant smuggling and human trafficking, I would argue that those markets to some degree have been restricted because the movement of people have been restricted. At least in our own monitoring, prices have increased. There's a greater degree of organized crime, but fewer people moving. And then a number of other markets like wildlife crime, where I think you can see some decline in consumer demand, given the linkage of the pandemic to the wildlife market, directly or indirectly, still to be determined. So I think it's important to draw a conclusion which says this is not uniform across the multiple markets where organized crime is active.
Drug markets, cybercrime, migrants and trafficking. Now let's go to Mr. Stroup. You work for Europol, and back in 2017 you produced SOCTA. Let's start off with that. How useful is a document today? Like, have you imagined that these changes, would ever happen?
Well, I think we all know that crises shape the way that organized crime operates in a way, and I don't think anyone could have imagined the occurrence of the pandemic on this scale. So we started monitoring quite early, actually, in around March, when the first lockdowns in Europe occurred. And we collected lots of operational data, strategic data, open source reporting, all around the different serious and organized crime phenomena and terrorism threats that we are aware of in Europe. So we collected lots of information, and I can only compliment what Mr. Shaw said, that really it emerged that we had different impacts over different time periods, different time horizons. So we looked at the short-term impact, and here we see a change in approach, not necessarily in the quality or quantity of crime. So criminals were remarkably quick to adapt their modus operandi. We saw this in the aforementioned cybercrime. So we had a lot of pandemic-themed campaigns. We saw this in the area of counterfeit and substandard goods, where we had a lot of fake PPE and other sort of hygienic equipment. We saw the emergence of different types of frauds and supply scams. And here I think it's quite interesting to note also the, I would call the lack of resilience of public procurement under pressure. When we've had so many instances where countries made purchases of non-existent dream quantities of face masks, countries that have very resilient processes in place. So it was very interesting for us to observe. Of course, we've seen the exploitation of opportunities as they were arising. One of my favorite examples that I always note is the use of repatriation flights of people that were stuck in South America, using those flights to traffic cocaine back to the EU. I mean, you have to be very quick on your feet to think of that. And then, of course, we've seen changes in the area of property crime.
Could you maybe just fill in on the cocaine smuggling, because I found an article where you stated that it has reached record levels via sea during the pandemic. Could you comment on that, maybe, Mr. Stroup?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in the early days, we saw some disruptions in some markets in the EU, some shortages of cannabis, but quite frankly, those were likely present even before the pandemic hit Europe. And as we went on, because I think it should be noted that the goods trafficking did not stop in the same degree as the goods shipping as it did for people traveling. So we still had containers coming from South America to Europe, and indeed we have seen record levels of cocaine seizures in the EU for the first half of 2020, even exceeding those record seizures that we saw in the first half of 2019.
Thank you. Now let's go to Mr. Ditchem. Your institute recently organized a panel discussion where it was stated that the COVID-19 is one of the biggest challenges to policing in the UK since the Second World War. Could you maybe elaborate on that? What is the effect on organized crime trends in the British Isles? Mr. Ditchem?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think the couple of things to point out really and echo some of the points that have been made is the impact is still yet to be felt, or we're still feeling it in a number of areas because, of course, COVID isn't over. In terms of some of the impact on policing, there was a lot of doomsday scenarios originally sort of scoped out as what might happen should there be huge civil unrest. But what we found in most countries actually that's not actually been the case, and that most people have been fairly compliant with the regulations. And of course, there's been different degrees of lockdown imposed in different states, but generally speaking, the public have been supportive of the law enforcement efforts. So suggestions at the very beginning that courses, annual leave would have to be cancelled, and possibly even in one article that murder investigations would be suspended, and that all activity would be directed to frontline services and assisting the other emergency services, have actually not materialised. So what was evident in relation to the webinar that we hosted actually was that there was, on the whole, a general feeling of support for law enforcement and a real desire to try and capitalise on that post-pandemic to lead to better public support for the police and better public-private cooperation.
Thank you. We will get back to that point. That's the last for our today's discussion. Now let's go to Mr. Sorrenti. I know it takes time to draft, peer review, and publish papers on these topics, but what are the preliminary reviews from academia regarding the impact of COVID-19 on organized crime?
Okay, so what I'm going to say is also very related to the paper that I published recently on the Review of Economics and Statistics that basically was showing that crises are opportunities for organized crime. What we do in the paper, we basically look at the 2008 financial crisis, and what I think that new research is going to show in the next years is that also in this case, a crisis like the one we are facing, this time is a pandemic, the last time was a financial crisis, is going to be a very important opportunity for organized crime to infiltrate even more territories where we find organized crime and to get even richer than what it actually is. So on this, I would like so my feeling, obviously I don't have any kind of data up to now because it's probably too early to say something, but what I can say is that I can imagine that also this crisis is going to be an incredible opportunity for organized crime to become even stronger than in the past, and we already, I think, have some signals in this direction. I would like just to briefly mention three facts that can corroborate this interpretation. The first one is that it's already clear, and there is already some evidence, for example, for the case of Italy, of some kind of organized crime infiltration by providing some kind of welfare to the part of the population that is suffering because of this crisis. We can think of people losing their jobs and mafia acting as a sort of in substitution of the institutions by providing some kind of welfare service. The second one that was already mentioned is the raising of new markets. This is another incredible opportunity for organized crime. We can think there are already some evidence of infiltrations of organized crime in the market for hand sanitizer or face masks. This was already said by the other panelists. And finally, I think that another risk we have to take into account, another risk that can be extremely important, is that if you take, for example, the case of the European Union, a lot of funds are going to be allocated through states in order to deal with this crisis. That is an unprecedented crisis in terms of also of the economic consequences of this crisis. And there is already some evidence, and we all know that mafia is going to try in every way to put its hands on these funds. And this is a very important risk we should really take into account. And I think we are going to see soon some of the kind of effects of this.
Thank you. We seamlessly transitioned into the second round of questions, which is on the economic downturn as a result of the pandemic and the risks that it brings. So maybe let's continue with you, Mr. Sorrenti, about the paper that you mentioned. Actually, you, if I'm not mistaken, you've established that in certain regions in Italy during the global economic crisis, those regions that had higher mafia presence actually fared better and were prone less to economic downturn. How do you explain this? Is mafia acting like some kind of a buffer in this sense?
Yeah, this is basically the idea of the paper. So let's consider what we do in the paper. In the paper, we take into consideration the 2008 financial crisis, and the idea is that a crisis makes people more vulnerable. They need more resources because suddenly something is changing in their life, and then the case was a crisis that were basically hitting a lot of entrepreneurs, especially in Italy, where small entrepreneurship is is a very important factor. So what we do in this paper, we want to compare what was the performance during the crisis in regions with respect to less presence of mafia, of organized crime there. And the idea is that those regions that only rely or mainly rely, because mafia is everywhere in Italy, so you have to think on intensity and not just on regions with or without mafia, but those regions with more organized crime, basically suddenly they had more resources to use because organized crime was there and organized crime was investing there. And so what we see is that the crisis also hit those provinces, obviously, but somehow the mafia was acting as a sort of social insurance for entrepreneurs in these areas. And this is exactly what it's very likely to happen again in the coming months.
Thank you. Now let's go back to Mr. Shaw. Global Initiative had this panel discussions, mafia entrepreneurship and how it is exploiting the pandemic. Could you maybe fill in on what Mr. Sorrenti just said? Is it true, and what are some other risks identified by the research? Mr. Shaw?
Thanks, Bjorn. We are funding a large number of civil society groups who are present in cities around the world, and I guess you could call those where there are gangs who have territorial control. So they are not as old as the mafia. Many have existed since the 50s or 60s, including in my hometown. And I think it's important to distinguish between the kind of assistance that is provided. On the one hand, when the pandemic struck in Brazil, in many African cities where there were gangs present, and these are hardcore, relatively violent, drug turf occupying gangs, food, cooking oil, toiletries were provided, often very publicly. And so what gangs wanted to do, I think, was to demonstrate that they were providing government-like functions, that they were building legitimacy within the communities that they operated. That period passed quite quickly, actually, and in almost all cases, the gangs provided those things very visibly with some fanfare over a period of time. Much more quietly, and I think this also aligns with what Giuseppe is saying about Italy, much more quietly, organized crime has been active in providing loans and buying up businesses at the same time. So there's these two parallel sets of developments that are occurring. The implications of both are what Angela mentioned in her opening comments, particularly in vast urban areas in the developing world, is I would argue growing criminal kind of embeddedness or control, a symbiosis with state actors. I think that may be one of the consequences of a long period of economic downturn as a result of the pandemic.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw. Ms. May, let's bring you into this. So UNODC also published this report where it said that boosted standing of criminal groups in society is also one of the opportunities that might be used. Would you maybe care to comment and also fill in on what Mr. Shaw just said?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I have understood your question because there is an echo. But if I understand what we have in this discussion on the impact of the economic crisis on organized crime. I think I just wanted to echo what Marco, Giuseppe, and others have said, and our research shows exactly the same. What maybe I would add is what we have been also trying to do has been to identify what are the sectors that may be more vulnerable to this, taking cash. I mean, the sectors that are now suffering for lack of liquidity because they've been particularly hit by the pandemic and the lockdowns. So, for example, tourism or transportations, etc. These are the sectors that will require particularly monitoring for those kind of infiltration. And also the sectors that on the opposite side are the ones that are most likely now to attract more funding. I mean, we all mentioned the health sector, but also, for example, the sectors that deals with deliveries or all of those sectors that have grown as response to the lockdown. Another comment that I want to make, in addition to what is said, is particularly in relation to the rural communities. The reports that we get from our colleagues from field offices is that those communities that have been traditionally vulnerable to illicit activities, I mean, mostly I'm talking about drug cultivation, but also, for example, illicit mining or other type of activities that are particularly relevant in some rural communities. The economic downturns will bring definitely, and we have already starting to see in some of these countries how actually more people are likely to engage in illicit activities as a way of responding to their economic crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Ditchem. Would you like to fill in on this? I read your op-ed. You wrote about the potential impact on COVID-19 on diversification of organized crime in Great Britain, online fraud that is expected to blossom. Would you maybe care to elaborate on that in relation to the economic downturn, which is palpable in the UK?
Yeah, thank you. I think, yes, as already been mentioned, with more people working remotely and working from home, then in some sectors, organised crime has moved its activity towards online activity in order to access markets. So we've seen that in a number of areas, leading to either large-scale cyber fraud or taking advantage of vulnerable populations, whether that be youngsters for the so-called county lines drugs distribution model that is prevalent in the UK and in a number of other countries, as well as other type of activity by paedophiles, etc. That's always been the case, but they now have easier access. I think one of the concerns is that one of the fallouts from the economic downturn is rising unemployment, and what that leads to is another vulnerable population that, as has been mentioned really already, are susceptible to buying illicit or fake goods or finding other means in order to get access to the criminal supplies that they want, which could be injurious to health, as one example. Certainly certain counterfeit goods that we've seen have been described as highly injurious. And I also think that on a more sort of macro scale, we'll see the impact of that on investment, unfair competition, high levels of organised crime infiltration into illicit activity, accounting for a much larger share of gross domestic product.
Thank you. And let's finish this round of questions with Mrs. Stroup. What is the Europol's take on these drivers? And I'll pose the next question after you finish that one. Mrs. Stroup?
Yeah, of course. We dug up our analysis of serious and organized crime developments after the last economic crisis and its aftermath, and I think that we will see quite a lot of similarities. What we see is not necessarily an increase in organized crime, but we see very significant shifts in criminal markets. So you see an increase in different types of property crimes, and those are crimes that have a very low entry level. So you can easily shift to property crimes. You don't necessarily need a lot of expertise for that. You'll see a change in the patterns of counterfeiting of goods. So last time for the financial crisis, we saw a lot more consumer goods counterfeiting. You expect to see more corruption, more financial crime, exactly the types of things that were already mentioned, infiltration in the legal economy in some of these very vulnerable sectors, and especially targeting companies and also real estate. But on the other hand, we also saw that really at the end of the crisis, we had stronger top-level organized crime groups that are consolidated their operations. They've consolidated their criminal structures, and that's a significant threat, and that's something we need to look at going forward as well. And of course, we have the increased vulnerability of certain groups in society to be recruited into a life of serious and organized crime. And I think we need to look at how we can stop that process.
Thank you. Let's now transition into the next topic, which is who are the most affected victims and how to protect them and how to actually reduce the cost and damage by these developments to human lives. So let's continue with you, Mrs. Stroup. Europol produced several reports, including the one on multi-million-dollar mask scams, cyber safety. You issued online safety advice for parents. Could you tell us from your point of view who are the most affected groups and what can be done to alleviate these negative consequences?
Yeah, I can talk at length about the affected groups. I don't know how much I have to say about how we can counter these issues. I think it's been quite clear as part of this crisis that certain types of criminal activities really target everyone. If you look at the cybercrime, at different types of fraud, you have the public sector affected, you have legal businesses and individual citizens that are being targeted in a very insidious manner. You have certain segments of the population, such as elderly people, which are also quite specifically targeted and exploited as part of different types of scams. Now, how to counter this? I would say a very important component is greater awareness. And we've been doing a lot of work, as you mentioned, around awareness campaigns, alerting the public, alerting businesses to the threats. But also in a way to increase a little bit the pressure on businesses to actually report now being victimized by certain types of scams and criminal operations, because we need that information from the private sector. It takes a while if businesses don't report this, and we have to collect this intelligence in some other way. This is unfortunate, and we can do a lot more if we work closer with businesses. If businesses are more quickly reporting these types of threats.
Thank you. Now let's go to Ms. May. Again, UNODC published a lot of reports, including the one on drug users, harmful practices they engage, and health impact, including short and long term. Could you maybe elaborate on that in the light of the question, which has to do with who are the groups that are most affected with the crisis?
Thank you. I would take, first I'll take from your question, the impact on drug use and drug users. And, initially with the lockdown, we had seen reporting some shortage of particularly heroin in Europe and in other countries that had directly affected drug users, where heroin was more difficult to find and less pure and more costly. But this supply has quickly restored, and where I think the impact on drug use is also most felt is on the accessibility of services, and with as we have experienced on all kinds of health services that were not COVID related, clearly the public health sector was struggling to provide provide services, and also in terms of treatment and prevention of drug use. That has been definitely less available. But the good news is that in the months that we have seen after the lockdowns, again around the world, from Asia to Europe, in the Americas, we have seen governments and service providers to find alternatives, to find actually innovative ways of delivering. And so we have seen, for example, in some countries delivering methadone through pharmacies. And so that in a way is something that hopefully the COVID has brought on something that stays as the accessibility of services. But if I may also comment on the victims of organized crime in general, I just also want to a small remark on something that they are not visible. I mean, the most visible victims are definitely the ones that are, the victims of homicide, of the big violence of organized crime. And there we really should remember that the young generation that in Central America and Latin America is really hardly affected on this. But if you want, I would like to also mention the invisible victims of organized crime in terms of the impact that organized crime has on the economic and social fabric of the societies. And so when they distort prices, when they bring unfair competitions, the victims are all those businesses that play a fair game in the economy, and all the people that they are entitled to their public services, and that they cannot access the public services because public resources are diverted toward the illicit activities of organized crime.
Thank you. Now I want to have Mr. Sorrenti chime in on this, because I really liked what you wrote in your paper about godfathers having comparative advantage to governments when it comes to filling in these gaps. Could you maybe tell us from your research if there are any strategies that these affected people have to to adapt? What are the how they build resilience in these situations, and what are the strategies used by mafia, by organized crime groups?
Let me say that something that I would like to highlight, especially if we take into account the Italian context, is that I think that one of the most vulnerable groups of people is the one made by entrepreneurs, and in particular small entrepreneurs in Italy. And we have to take into account that this COVID-19 really implied lockdowns, closures of activities, and somehow the tightening of the credit supply. So the idea is that, yes, it's true that the victims probably are going to be the entrepreneurs, and in particular small entrepreneurs, but also their families. So basically this means that many families are going to have much lower resources in the coming months. And remember that in such a framework, what we try to claim and we try to show in the paper is that organized crime might become somehow a more appealing resource to survive this kind of crisis. And this can allow organized crime to infiltrate even more a certain territory and to become stronger and stronger over time. So obviously it's not easy to understand how to deal with it and how to try to limit this. So what we can do, I think that the best thing to do is to start really trying to find ways to help entrepreneurs and families in order to make much less attractive the kind of alternative financial resources they can obtain, especially when organized crime is present, increase the monitoring and the vigilance, especially in some sectors that were mentioned as potential sectors infiltrated, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, and to improve, and this is really something that should be done, for example, in Italy, improve the transparency and make standardized procedures to allocate funds in order to deal with this.
Thank you. As somebody coming from Serbia, I'm very well aware of how difficult it is to fight organized crime once it becomes so accepted within society, which is the situation we had during the 90s. But now I want to go back to Mr. Ditchem and the situation in the United Kingdom. Again, who has proven to be most vulnerable in the United Kingdom? And also, what about the government's responses? Because I believe Whitehall resources have been taken up probably by Brexit and handling the pandemics. So what about the policy implications and tackling these challenges?
Yes, thank you for your question. Yeah, the pandemic couldn't have come at a worse time for us when we're trying to negotiate Brexit and set up trade deals with various countries at a time when I think the global trade is going to be something somewhat hard to pursue. So, in terms of priorities for the UK government, well, the government has spent a lot of effort in trying to initially support the health service to make sure that wasn't overrun. And I detect now more of a priority given to trying to keep the economy functioning. So whilst there's still a desire to make sure that the health service doesn't become overwhelmed, there's greater emphasis placed on business. But there's a lot that business can do to try and make sure that it remains safe and doesn't allow organised crime to infiltrate. Likewise with government, with some of the funding schemes that there's been allegations of because they were rushed through, that perhaps some of the due diligence and mechanisms that would be in place to ensure that fraudsters don't take advantage have been perhaps not as robust as they should be. But I think that situation has been largely remedied, and certainly there's an opportunity now for stakeholders really across public and private sections to share information, as was mentioned earlier. And also to ensure through good cybersecurity, in particular for those that are working from home and those that are vulnerable to cyber attack, that actually they are equipped with the right information and the ability to protect themselves. So the UK government and the law enforcement agencies such as the National Crime Agency have put a lot of effort into reducing the opportunities, highlighting the scams and the infiltration of organised crime so that people can better protect themselves.
Thank you. Let's finalize this round with Mr. Shaw. Global Initiative published some very ominous reports titled Dark Pharma, Counterfeiting Medical Goods, Human Trafficking. Based on your research, who are, again, the question is, who are the groups that are most affected? But also I would like to maybe for you to point, if your research has shown, what are some good practices or responses identified across the globe?
From our perspective and from the reporting of both the civil society groups that we are supporting and others, I think in many big urban centers in the developing world, young people are now very vulnerable. Partly schools have been closed. There's been a recruiting drive around gangs in Nairobi, in Cape Town, in Rio and elsewhere. So there's people have been particularly vulnerable in this period. Combined, I think, with a real, and of course it's difficult to know the exact numbers, but when you look at the volume of sites that are being accessed, the degree to which sexual exploitation of children on the internet, I think, poses a serious threat going forward. People have more time, children are vulnerable in the developing world. So those two groups in particular. I wanted to pick up on a point Angela made, which I think is important going forward, again in gang-dominated areas, and that's that violence involving often young men reduced in the first months or weeks of the lockdown. But what you see now is a kind of U-shaped pattern in several places where violence is returning and returning with vengeance. Now, it's not always clear why that is the case. It's often a struggle around a new drug turf, a mobilization, a consolidation of both territory and gang membership. So I think it's very important to understand that we're moving into a new period now. What is to be done? In many developing countries, and indeed in many developed countries, the space between citizens and the police distanced during the pandemic. And in fact, there were instructions for many police officers not to approach people directly, etc. I think a lot of that distance has to be bridged again. There needs to be, I think, a serious effort in many of these communities to rebuild resilience, to rebuild connections with the state. there is some opportunities, I think, with large amounts of development money and government money flowing back to provide services in some areas, to re-establish links, to push back, if you like, criminal governance in these particular areas. I don't think that will be easy, and governments need a strategy to be able to do that, to link with legitimate actors in many of these environments. I think that's the challenge in the months and the years ahead around criminal governance.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw. And let me use your presentation as a segue into the last round of questions on the using this crisis as an opportunity to reform criminal justice systems. So, Mr. Shaw, you recently wrote an op-ed with Walter Camp, and I think you mentioned one of the points that you made in this op-ed is regarding the overdue police reform that is needed in light of what is happening in the United States and also as response to COVID. So in addition to resilience, what are some other ideas that you feel that you want to present, maybe, or the directions towards where this reform should be heading?
Thanks, Bojan. One of the advantages, a little bit disconnected from the example you're raising, but one of the advantages or opportunities I thought might emerge from the pandemic on reform was the fact that large numbers of prisoners were released. Now, that varied dramatically across the world. When you look at the overall numbers, in fact, it's quite small. It's about just under 600,000 prisoners were released globally, and there's around 11 million people incarcerated. So it's not a dramatic proportion of the global prison population. But it is symbolic in the sense that many people who were released were low-level offenders. And of course, in Italy and elsewhere, there was a discussion about the release of organized crime figures. But at least at a point, in a crisis like the pandemic, I think it opens up some new thinking potentially, for example, about alternative sentencing. Do we need everybody low-level drug users in prison? Are there alternatives, et cetera, et cetera? And I think it's very much up to both civil society, but people active in the UN and government, to use the space that the pandemic has provided to push policies and alternative policies to reduce the pressure on the criminal justice system, to speed up the process, to make the criminal justice system more transparent and open. If I may just add one other example on our monitoring across a number of states, which has been a success of the pandemic, is the quite dramatic shift of court procedures into a virtual environment. And that has occurred, really, it's quite astonishingly across a range of countries, speeding up the process, particularly of low-level processes, if you like, however, with many challenges of public access and transparency. So I wonder if that's not one of the areas that will come out of the pandemic, which may have a longer-term impact on criminal justice.
Thank you. Yeah, we had Skype court proceedings in Serbia as well. Now let's go to Mr. Ditchem. You mentioned, again, the topic is opportunity to reform criminal justice systems. In one of your papers, you wrote that because of the increased fraud, we might need more financial officers. But what are other things that you see as a potential for improving the work, and particularly for the UK? Because if Brexit is happening, the UK will lose access to EU databases. How do you expect things to proceed in this regard?
Thank you for the question, and that is a concern, because the UK profits immensely from its current access to databases and the access it afforded through Europol in particular. But I would say, conversely, so does Europe and so does Europol from the intelligence and the information that the UK shares. And I think certainly at a practitioner level, there is a real desire to make sure that the security apparatus is not significantly weakened through Brexit or through any other kind of activity. However, it's a difficult negotiation, and I totally accept that. And it's causing many a sleepless night, I think, for a number of politicians on both sides. But I think, having spent a large chunk of my career working internationally, information sharing is the key to cooperation and to solving problems. Good cooperation, good international cooperation, and we can only hope that a pragmatic solution is found that enables us to play a part in Europe still in terms of intelligence and information sharing, bring the expertise and skills that we have, but also benefit and learn from and continue to work closely with our European partners. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to pick on the information exchange and cooperation and hand it over to Mrs. Stroup, because Europol recently published Beyond Pandemic report, where some of the recommendations are actually increased information exchange and cooperation. Maybe Mrs. Stroup, if you would like to fill in on that, in regards to the opportunity to use this situation to reform criminal justice system.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the flexibility of organized crime to adapt, to exploit opportunities. And I have to say, the current situation has also shown that law enforcement has the capacity to mount quite a flexible response. So that involves targeted information, communicating with the public, and especially, as you mentioned, effective information exchange between different law enforcement actors in Europe and beyond Europe. So in fact, what we saw during the pandemic was an initial decrease in the information exchange by 30% in the first months of the pandemic, but then actually a very remarkable and very swift recovery when we're looking at towards the end of May, where we actually had information exchange going back to pre-pandemic levels. So that shows that there have been a lot of adjustments, very quick adjustments to the processes in law enforcement organizations to enable them to work from home, to communicate effectively, not only with their immediate partners, but also with partners further afield in Europe. And that also included some effective redeployment of certain resources. And as I mentioned, a lot of the adjustment of processes. I think it puts us in quite a good place to intensify information exchange. But of course, the long-term impact of all of this on law enforcement remains to be seen. But indeed, there are opportunities, and we're quite pleased with, in terms of information exchange, how resilient the system that we built with our partners has been.
Thank you. And now let's go to Ms. May. Definitely share your thoughts on the opportunity to reform, but I would also like you maybe to reflect on the use of data in this process, because you're having the PhD in statistics and also contributing to 2 volumes of statistical perspectives regarding use of data to fashion policy options to respond to COVID. Ms. May, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bojan. And actually, now you give me an opportunity to wish everyone a good World Statistics Day. Today, the 2010-2020 is the World Statistics Day. So it's a good way to close some of our remarks to remind of the importance of data and statistics and also in relation to the COVID. And I have to say, for us at least, the way how COVID has provided an opportunity also has been to see how we need to modernize our data and statistical system. And so we have reacted by making a call to all member states to provide to us data and information, but we also have resorted to big data and to see how we could learn, what we could learn from, the big data system to understand what was happening on COVID, where the traditional data collection system, of course, particularly those relating to fieldwork, survey, etc., were disrupted. So what, for example, the importance that we have seen with the data, we saw it. I just also wanted to make a plea on, on how we wanted to address the issue of COVID and organized crime, and the importance of understanding and anticipate the threat that organized crime is posing. And one way is also to understand the new opportunity that organized crime has. And I just give an example of when we will have a vaccine, when we will have a treatment, Until this will not be available for everyone in the world, this will provide an opportunity to organized crime to fill that data gap that supply gap with either falsified or an existence or scam relating to this. So the importance of using the data not only to describe phenomena, what is happening now, but also to understand and anticipate what organized crime may see as an opportunity, so that we are able to target better our efforts.
Thank you, Ms. May, on this short masterclass in evidence-based policymaking. And then to finalize with Mr. Sorrenti, I see you're becoming jittery, waiting to finalize the panel. In your paper, you wrote that the key issue, and I'm asking this again within the broader framework of the opportunity to reform criminal justice system. You wrote that the key issue is the weak institutional presence in certain geographical areas, and in the short run after the crisis happens, who comes first to fill in this vacuum? And it's usually the organized crime groups, according to your research. So if you can maybe share some thoughts in this direction.
Yeah. Let me just start by sort of highlighting also, in my view, the importance of data. So I work with data 90% of my time when I do my research. So I think that's one of the first very important things that we have to do now, is to collect as many data as we can and really try to, because this is going to help us. And this is something that I would like really to stress in this panel, that it's very interesting how economists in the last years have sort of invested more and more of their resources to try to understand organized crime. And obviously the understanding of organized crime is very complicated, because it's very easy, it's very difficult to find data that allows for this, and let's say what we call identification strategy that really allows us to understand how organized crime operates, because organized crime hides its activities, obviously. So for what concerns some of the implications of the paper, and the paper that we were discussing, so in the paper we really stress the importance of monitoring and vigilance. So the idea that everything should be more structured, especially in a system like the Italian one. And when we say this, we think some laws that should, and procedure that should be standardized in order to make policymakers and make institutions able to check every suspicious transaction, every suspicious movement of capitals, in order to being able to understand where organized crime is really infiltrating the economy. And the other thing is, obviously, I think I really want to stress again the importance of institutions. So wherever we have a doubt that organized crime is really settled, there it's really important to try to improve the kind of institutional setting there, because this is the only way to try to really fight and contrast the power of organized crime, and in particular to try to diminish the social consensus that organized crime can raise in part of the local population due to the institution, the sort of lack of institutional setting.
Thank you. And with this, I would finalize my part of the moderation. And because we started 15 minutes later, we have 10 more minutes to finalize the panel. And I just received a question from the audience for all of the panelists. Feel free to contribute. So the question is, how did COVID-19 affect transnational law enforcement and civil society cooperation against organized crime? And how can the good guys being, I suppose, us here and law enforcement agencies and the other actors working on it, how can they adapt to this new reality? The floor is open. Anybody can comment. Anyone?
From a civil society side, I have to say that I think COVID improved the cooperation between networks of civil society virtually, and not in terms of physical meetings and others. But I think very important networks have been built from local environments up to the global level, and I think that's important to emphasize. One point which is worth making on law enforcement, at least from our contacts with law enforcement agencies around the world, is how badly law enforcement agencies suffered with people getting sick in the early days of the pandemic, and how that had a really disruptive effect in that early phase, calling on retired law enforcement officials, etc., etc. And I think when the story of all of it is written, that will also be an important factor to highlight.
Thank you. I also saw Mr. Ditchem raise his hand. Do you want to contribute as well? Please just unmute yourself. Oh, yeah. No, it's fine. Yeah, we can hear you. Go.
Yep. Okay. All I was going to add was that what we've seen in a number of countries as well with people working from home is, yes, one side of the coin, there's a degree of vulnerability, particularly in terms of cyber attack, but actually there's also a degree of greater protection of people re-engaging with their family, greater familial oversight, more time spent with family, reinforcing those bonds. When we look at exploitation of vulnerable children, quite often, and particularly around gangs as well, some of the solutions lie in that reinforcing the role of the family and those familial ties. So it's been reported in the UK by a number of academics as well that actually the lockdowns and people working from home has given a number of victims and vulnerable people an opportunity to reassess their lives and to actually change their activity and possibly even escape from the gangs.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything. If not, then maybe before we close, we fairly discussed the impact of COVID-19 on organized crime in global terms. But I would just briefly like your comments on what is your first association that pops into your mind when you hear organized crime in the Western Balkans, because this is where we are the organizers of this panel. So what is the first thing that comes to your mind? But try to connect it with COVID as well, but in a more general comment as well would be appreciated. Who wants to go first?
I can maybe say something on that for 1 second. Okay, well, if you ask me what comes to mind, organized crime in the Western Balkans is the immense expansion of influence of organized crime groups originating from the Western Balkans, even through the pandemic time in South America, and really the increasing importance of these groups in buying in bulk, not necessarily by themselves, but even pooling funds to purchase large amounts of cocaine and trafficking those to Europe. So this is the first thing that comes to mind, and that's something that's most certainly has continued throughout the pandemic period.
Thank you. I would like to hear more answers. Maybe Ms. Matt, because you have this more, again, global. Where does the Western Balkans fit into this global organized crime landscape?
Yeah. I think I understood. I'm sorry, but I have a terrible echo, Bojan, when you speak. So I have really difficulties understanding. But if I understand correctly, what comes to mind when we hear organized crime in Balkans, one thing that comes to my mind is, first of all, the global reach of the Balkan groups, and the global reach, and also the multi-purpose reach. Because I think these are groups that are involved in basically all types of organized crime activities. And the roles that they have, particularly in distributing, I'm thinking about, for example, the role on heroin, the crucial role of the Balkan groups in moving huge bulk coming from Afghanistan to smaller quantities and to distribute the heroin in Europe. And also what comes to mind is also the availability of firearms, and again, the roles that they have in distributing firearms, not only within the region, but there are also examples of them selling firearms outside of the region. So if I have to sum up in one word, I would say what comes to my mind is the distributor role that organized crime groups have globally.
Thank you. And then we have 2 more minutes to finish the panel. So I would just like maybe to try to summarize, if I may there. So some of the key points is that most of us most of the world has been surprised by the effect that COVID-19 had, the impact that COVID-19 had on organized crime. That the impact has changed throughout time and has not been uniform throughout sectors and geographical regions. That resilience among state institutions has been almost non-existent, whereas organized crime groups showed much greater ability to adapt. And then I think we agreed on this, that the actual effects will only be felt in the near future. So with this, I'd like to thank you for participating and sharing your thoughts on this very important topic. And once again, I would like to thank our audiences who are with us online, and I hope that we will get to continue this discussion on this very important topic in the future in a much more pleasant setting next time, I hope, and after this pandemic is over. Thank you all, and have a good night.